So Pete, you're obviously the editor of Accidents in North American Climbing. I've been in the book. Alex, I think you have too. Is that right?
I'm not sure.
I am sure. We
Oh,
double
are you?
checked.
Which thing am I in?
You were, I think, in 2016. Would that have been
Oh,
right?
I wrote up. Yeah, I wrote up when Sonny dropped me. I remember that.
Yep.
That's kind of embarrassing. Yeah. So yeah, I have been in it kind of recently.
Yeah.
I forgot that I
Yep.
wrote that up.
Yeah, what was the accident? Out of curiosity.
It's my now wife lowered me off the end of the rope by accident, though it's just her lowering me off the end of the rope, but it wasn't really her fault because she had just started climbing and I was using a rope that was too short, and basically I set everything. I like set her up for failure. There was like no knot in the end of the rope. I was like, here we go, let's do this thing, and then it turns out the rope was too short. But it was kind of a confluence of a bunch of things where, like, right before I started to pitch, I switched to her parents' rope because I was like, oh, we can leave a top rope on it for them, and it turns out their rope was way shorter than my rope, and uh, you know, it was like all those kinds of things that add up. And so I only fell like 15 feet, and I got banged up, but it wasn't that serious. But it was a sort of obvious and preventable. I mean, it's exactly the kind of accident that you read about in accidents in North American mountaineering. You're like, oh, what a botch.
Yeah, it's funny. Like an accident like that is like it's the Swiss cheese effect. It's a couple things line up, and suddenly you have this hole you can put your finger through with in a piece of cheese. So yeah,
Yeah, no, that was exactly it. We are kind of like, oh, several things happened, and then as a result, I fell and got hurt. And you're like, well, that's why you write it up so that people pay attention to all the different things.
Do you feel, Pete, like, is that the point of the book? Is it basically to kind of educate and, what do you feel like the mission is behind Accidents?
yeah, I think it is to educate. I think because I remember reading accidents in North American mountaineering when I was just starting climbing, and there's kind of this morbid interest I had as a teenager in, well, what happens to other people when they do this or do that. Uh, and that later grew into just an interest in, well, what are the factors that went into contributing to an accident? And this was especially as I grew more and more sophisticated with my climbing. And I think, these days, uh, yeah, we are here to, portray and report accidents, and in some cases, provide advice or information that might be helpful. We don't prescribe a specific solution for a specific accident because there's so many things that go into any one given accident, and there's also no exact right way to do specific things. So, I mean, as we
But
all
but
know
it
as
is
climbers, like there's
but it is helpful the way you guys categorize the accidents, where at the end it always summarizes it with like, fall with poor gear and loose rock or whatever. It breaks it into categories where you're kind of like, these are the things that contributed to an accident. And I think I always really like that, where you're kind of like, these are the handful of things. I mean, it might not be prescriptive, where it's like, this is what you should do in the future exactly, but it does break them into categories that help you identify which factors cause which accidents.
yeah. I mean, thanks for
Like,
saying that.
poor pro.
It's yeah, yeah. And so I think what it does is it gives the user a chance to ponder and think about, well, what could have been done to prevent this, and what are perhaps the best practices. And we're trying to get people to educate themselves because that's what it actually takes these days in climbing. And every so often I get an indignant email saying you should have told this person to always use 3 points of contact or something like that. And I'm like, well, if we all use 3 points of contact, we would still be climbing 5-7.
Yeah,
And
tell that
so
to
we
Chris
have to,
Sharma.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
he's using
Chris,
one
three
point of
points of
contact.
contact.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're
Or,
like, come on.
or no points.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
He's
So,
just flying between holds. Yeah,
yeah. So I think sometimes people wish there was like a distinct singular prescription we could give as a solution, but that's not the business we're in. And I don't think that can be reflected in climbing because climbing is so many things, as we all know.
Yeah, and that's what I always thought was the coolest of like helping people write up their stories for the accidents book, or working with people through like their reports, and is that like primary cause and contributory causes list that Alex was talking about that I think is so interesting, that provides that like reflection that you were talking about, Pete, like, you know, if you look at Alex's accident, it's like, well, the direct cause of the accident is that he was dropped off the end of the rope. But when you look at like the more important thing really is to look at all the contributing factors like miscommunication and maybe rushing and maybe we're distracted and inexperience and, you know, all those things that you're like, oh, that's where you get like the big takeaway point. Like we all know that you're going to like fall to the ground if you get dropped off the end of the rope. That's not really where the learning is. It's like, well, why were you in that? You know, like why did that happen? Like, oh, switching of the rope, like all those details are the things that I feel like you're like, oh, okay. That's what I feel like where like a lot of the learning happens. And I love that like contributory list. Was I off route? Was I exceeding my abilities? Was it dark? You know, was I just like gripped out of my mind, you know, and like not making very good decisions? Like those are the sort of things that actually cause accidents and like provide all that insight other than just like, oh, I fell and that's why I got hurt, you know?
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes there's these small things that throw people off. It's like, and it causes them to lose attention. So in Alex's case, it's like, well, I switched over to my girlfriend's parents' rope. So something that takes you out of like your normal process and procedure, distracts you, and then, yeah, something happens. Because it seems to me that, you know, it's almost the majority of accidents are due to inattention. Like the people already know how to do things right, but it's that moment of distraction that gravity's always there. It's always waiting to get you. So, yeah.
I always love the to what Lauren was saying, the sterile language in the reports. It was like, you know, failure of protection and you know, off route and whatever. Basically just like a handful of little sterile like, and then this thing happened. But you're like, the reality is some total freaking Gumby is having the epic of their life and then botches it and gets hurt. You're sort of like, you know, it's summarized as you know, poor decision making, late start,